Welcome to Improv Your Parenting, the art of turning parenting into play. Today we're joined by Matt Larson. Matt studied under Del Close, Martin DeMack, and Stephen Colbert, performing long and short-form improv for almost 20 years at I.O. Chicago, Second City, Comedy Sports, and The Playground. Favorite teams include the Lindbergh Babies, Morning in Denver, and International Stinger. With his spouse, another veteran of the Chicago improv scene, he is a father of 2 children who have so far resisted improv's siren song. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Improv Your Parenting. Always start with the same question, which is, how do you interact with kids, and in what way does improv play a role in that interaction?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have 2 kids, age 15 and age 8, almost 9. And I'd have to say that, improv precedes having children. I fell in love with improv in high school, which would have been probably a little young to have children. Exactly. So, way to go, getting things in the right order.
Yeah.
And then pursued it in Chicago and actually met my spouse in improv. We're both improvisers, for better and for worse, because we can quote yes and to our kids all day long, but especially in the early years, boy, they didn't even understand the words. I can say that I would not be who I am today without improv. And I can also say that improv for me was a long journey. If at some point I had cut it off sort of more arbitrarily, if I weren't as determined a person as I am, I don't think that I would be as good of an improviser parent as I am, because there were some lessons that took some years to soak in. And I'm going to say that the first lesson that I really felt in improv that definitely gears towards my parenting, and here I'm going to name drop a little bit, was during college, we fell in love with my college improv troupe, the Tower Players from Miami University of Oxford, Ohio, took a trip up to Chicago. And we were doing short form improv at the time. And so we were very excited to do Comedy Sports. And then there was also this sort of, there's also Second City, which was the big name. And the person who taught the workshop there was Martin DeMack. And that was just the hugest draw for me. I was like, okay, this feels like home. And it took me a few years to realize Chicago improv is not all Martin DeMack. The big thing to come out of classes with Martin, there were a couple phrases that he tended to use. One of them was, it's so easy to be funny. Why bother? And I thought that was really profound. I was going to wind it back a little bit to a question that I saw that you asked, which was one of the things like, do my parents improvise? And the answer is absolutely not. My dad was very artful. He's still around. But when I was in his care, I was sometimes driven crazy by the fact that he was very good at telling a joke, but it was, you'd press play on a recorder, basically, and then the joke would come out the same way. If you interrupted him in the process of telling the joke, he would pause, look at you, and then continue on as though, like, why did you interrupt me? But it always felt like he had a cluster of jokes that he could tell. He'd learn a new joke and retell it, and that would be great. But for me, one of the earliest lessons of improv, and this is finally getting back to the nature of your question, was you don't have to, trying to be funny is the last thing you want to do. I'm not going to tell, and this is where it gets into parenting, I'm not going to tell dad jokes, or at least if I am, I'm going to be very aware that I'm telling a dad joke and go outside of what is my comfort. Instead, I'm going to try and connect on kind of an emotional level and really try and understand where someone is coming from. Now, when they're barely able to talk and they're toddling around in diapers, that interaction tends to be more on a physical, maybe more clowning level, if you're just trying to get them to laugh. Or to understand their perspective, there's a lot of listening. That's the other lesson of improv and performance in general, which is that it is primarily listening based. Listening is absolutely important, and listening on numerous levels, but primarily the lesson that took a long time to soak in was emotionally listening, feeling how someone is feeling. In improv, we use that generally as a tool to inform how we're writing and performing a scene. We listen to our own feelings, how we're projecting those feelings. We layer those feelings on top of each other to create an interesting scene. And then this is where the comedy comes in. Sometimes go against the grain of that. Whatever problem there is, we make it worse. And I'm going to say that's where parenting and improv hopefully diverge. Sometimes it diverges. And if it doesn't, then you realize, oh no, I'm in an improv scene this is where you start to feel sympathy for all the characters you created over the years. It's all well and good as long as you put on a British accent and pretend you're in the comedy of manners. That's kind of a long answer, and also just sort of scratching the surface of what ways improv has informed my parenting.
You mentioned a couple things that I want to dive into. There is listening, paying extreme attention to what the other is offering you, whether it's physicality when they were young and in diapers or words as they get older.
Mm-hmm.
And then figuring out, how do I respond with emotion to that?
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's, do we dive into the painful, which is improv, or do we try to make this work, which is normal life and not trying to be a decent parent, or both, and just, whatever the hell comes out of that. You knew that going in when you had kids, is you had some of those skills already.
Yeah.
Through the training, through being an improviser. And so did you recognize as you were parenting, like, oh, I'm using this thing? Or was it looking back and being like, oh, I used that thing? Did any of that take place?
Well, that's a really good question. Was there a light bulb moment where I went, oh, it's the improv exercise. I'm mirroring my child and we're both... No, rarely, especially in the early years. I can't say that I'm such a confident parent, especially out of the gate, that I was like, oh yeah, I know I'm going to raise an improv child. I knew improv parents who knew they were going to raise an improv child. They were amazing. My spouse and I used them for practice before we had a child. We were like, we'll babysit for you. Their child was not yet 1 year old, but they were doing baby signing and they were like practicing using the potty, and they kind of swirl the pee in the air and would be like, okay, time for potty. And the child was not actually ready to use the potty, but it was really good practice. I can say that they nailed it. We did not, because in a way, they also had a lot of experience in early child education where we were just earnest, but painfully so. I'm going to also say this. There's the rare exception to this, but almost no one takes to the stage in improv and is like, I am now going to perform the most brilliant improv you'll ever see. Oftentimes they see the level of improvisational dexterity of the people who are really good at improv, and they're like, they make that look so easy. It's got to be easy. No, it's the ease of so much practice. It's like a gymnast making backflips look easy. You try it, you fall, you hurt. And parenting is so like that. If I were to draw a line of comparison, especially in the early years to parenting, it was that there was a lot of failure. Similar to my early years in improv, I was raised by people who made it look easier than it actually was, because by the time I knew them, they'd had a lot of practice. There's a part two to this, which is gradually I realized that I would be using improv training, like connecting to an emotion. Kids play a lot. I would say this is where improv should have been taught, or maybe some of my chief improv inspirations could have been less childless, because the general gist was like, you need to learn to play like children. Children are so giving and they live in a world of creation. My kids, when they would play, would be like, here's what you do.
Yeah.
No, you're doing it right. They were little dictators. If I would stop the scene to remind them that we don't say no, we don't ask questions, and we stay in the present, they did not like that at all.
No.
I mean, they broke every rule of improv, and yet still the scene continued and no one pulled the lights. And that was really frustrating.
I love that, because that completely reflects my experience as well. Initially, when my kids would play or create stories, I wasn't getting to contribute to that. It was, Daddy, this is what you say, this is what you do, and this is how we play. And I'm like, God, this is so boring. How do you enjoy it? The learning journey that you talked about is fascinating to me. For both the improv and the parenting, it was very much if I got what you said right, you're figuring out, you're trying things, you're failing, you're trying something else, you're figuring it out, and something hits and you're like, oh, cool, let's try that again. So you're figuring out how to play with that other person, how to do this thing, which in this case would be parenting. Mm-hmm. And so it's the exploratory journey that is allowing you to be the parent that this person needs.
Yeah.
And that sort of trained on by your improv journey.
Yeah, definitely. The idea of exploring and heightening. You know that kids will explore, and you're guaranteed that they will heighten, because their brains are going to change and their bodies are going to change, and everything's a moving target. Where when you study improv as an adult, hopefully everyone is potty trained. And when you start that journey with kids, you definitely wish that someone would pull lights sooner. The other training that you experience in improv is that like, wow, we're stuck in a scene and there's no end in sight. And so you just got to make the best of it. But yes, exploring and heightening is key to what we think kids need. I think one of the challenges with parenting, especially in the modern day where there are many things that can keep kids occupied, but that don't necessarily feed them or are less utilitarian in the long run. Like when I was a kid, you had to sit through daytime television if you were at home sick. And so you just looked like you would either turn on the TV and you watch daytime soaps, or you cracked open a book, or you sat and just were sad until cartoons came on. Now it's just an endless content library for $15 a month. Kids can sit and binge watch in ways that we know are unhealthy as adults, but they don't necessarily know as kids. You have to break them of that in order to force them to explore. They're still exploring. Even when they're watching and sitting idly by, they're absorbing lessons. My son, when he was 3 years old, had access to Netflix and an uninterrupted block of time. I'm pretty sure that we were all sick or otherwise occupied. He found a show on Netflix called Number Blocks. Typical to a lot of kids shows, it's music, it's numbers. In a way, it's kind of creepy because like each number has a personality, which is close to how I perceive numbers, my own kind of neurodivergent way. But then they'll talk and they'll interact, but then they'll also combine and they'll become a totally different personality, which to me implies like a loss of the sense of self, but they aren't bothered by it. And they sing and they dance and they combine and watching them combine and watching the numbers with their personalities led my son to being kind of unable to count to like within 2 weeks being able to count. Like he was just on top of it. And since then, like he's continued to like, he just really kind of loves math. We do math as kind of like sort of verbal exercises, sort of like if you're familiar with the improv form, the bat, we do a sort of a math bat in that we're just talking and we're like there's no paper and we're just tossing numbers back and forth.
I would like to have you explain that to me, but then also I wanted to dive into your son and how your experience with him in play has changed as he's gotten older, because you said he's 15 now. And then you also mentioned neurodivergence, and I'd love to dive into that area as well.
Absolutely.
Whichever direction you want to go first.
My son is 8 now. My daughter is...
Oh, I had him backwards.
New scene. But yeah, it feels like each kid we've had like created... Now we do more creative play. A couple of years ago, as he was getting into SpongeBob SquarePants, I never watched SpongeBob SquarePants. There's an aspect of it that drives me crazy, which is they're underwater. But every once in a while, they'll talk about water in water. They create a pool behind the Krusty Krab, and then they turn up the temperature so that it becomes hot and everyone has to swim in the pool. But they're already in water. It's maddening to me. I'm a fan of Tom Kenny from back in the Mr. Show days. I'm aware of his voice and love his voice. And then I realized at some point that I could kind of do an impression of his voice and almost every male character on SpongeBob SquarePants, which led to my son and I taking walks and me doing a full-on SpongeBob SquarePants show minus Pearl and Sandy for him. And it was all improvised. I remember I had it going for about 20 minutes. And I think it even wraps nicely with a bow. And so I was like, I nailed it. And like, I had an audience of one.
And it'll never happen again. And did he love it?
He did love it. And it's also someone else's character. So it's not like I can be like, hey, Tom Kenny, I do an impression of you. Because he'd be like, that's great. Thanks. So yeah, that's sort of improv with the kids. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but
how has play changed with them as babies?
Yeah, thank you for tying me back down. Play has changed in that I can do longer form. It's less about physical play, clowning, and more about finding a moment. And like, I can be more clever. This is actually something I was thinking about as I was reading over your questions. This feeds into my own journey in improv, which was, and also sort of this hails back to what I was saying earlier, which is, it took a while for improv for me to lock down, because at first I thought improv and comedy was being clever.
But it does take a long time for people to realize that. It's not about that at all.
There are extremely clever improvisers. Seth Meyers famously did a show with Jill Benjamin. It was a show where like people went on dates, and it was like 30 minutes long or whatever it was, but it was different scenes of people on dates. And then at the end of the show, Seth Meyers would summarize each scene that they had done and that would be the final beat of the show. Like, that is immensely clever, but it would mean nothing if the repeat of the show had not had those connections and emotional moments. And so, yeah, I early on vibed with the cleverness of that and thought, if I build up those muscles, I'll soar. It took me a long time to connect emotionally to the scenes and to my fellow partners. So play has changed in that I can be more clever. Okay, they're not going to get my 80s references. Most of my coworkers won't. I wanted to pull out the reference to Andrew Ridgeley from Wham! The other day.
I'm sure that would have gone over great.
Like a lead balloon. But then I realized I had to age it up. I mean, you live long enough, this is what happens. So I can still be more clever and pull in more references that they will get, but also with the knowledge that it's not about references, it's about connection. Early on in play with kids, you have to be gentle. You have to play with an eye towards guiding them to become a better person. As they get older, especially with my daughter, you can be like, let's make the bad choice. The phrase that comes back to me often as I tell stories to people is like, bad choices make the best stories. My dad took me rafting when I was 12 years old. I was just a chubby kid. He'd gone whitewater rafting. This was in Pennsylvania on the Youghiogheny River. And he'd gone rafting. And it was like the easiest thing in the world. But for me, he decided he'd build it up. And he was like, this is so dangerous. You better watch out on this river. Stay super focused. I was like, okay, Dad. Yeah, I got it. I'll be super focused. Well, it had rained a bunch in Pennsylvania in the weeks leading up to this whitewater rafting trip. So a 5-hour rafting tour was compressed into 3 hours, and it was real dangerous. And so like, bad choice, Dad? Oh yeah. My dad tells this story, and we tell the story over and over because it's like, what a funny bad choice. We got popped out of that raft like 4 times. I smoothed a bunch of skin. And like we all survived. Everybody made it to the end of that tour, as far as we know. But the guides were busy. It was a bad choice. And now I can encourage my kids to make a safe, bad choice and not feel bad about it.
I love that. Safe, bad choices. Yeah, because that's how we learn where that line is and also where our capabilities are, because often they're beyond where we believe they might be.
Absolutely. My kids, especially, and I think a lot of kids will confidently stride forward into full-on traffic. And so you can kind of yank them back and you're like, okay, new choice here. But then eventually all that gets locked in. My son is starting to enter the more shy years. As you get pressed in on with all the other personalities around you, you start to realize, well, I'm not like those other people all the time. And maybe I need to do more fitting in. And then those choices become a lot more, we'll call them vanilla, but vanilla is a valid flavor. And you have to encourage them to break out and be themselves, even as there's pressure to not be themselves. If they can do that in a safe way, then I think that leads to a better human, or at least I'm going to say somebody who avoids some of the teenage trauma that I went through in terms of feeling like on the inside, I do not fit in. And on the outside, I'm just this blank wall. And this is going to lead over to your other question, which is neurodivergence. Our whole family is very neurodivergent. It's one of those like, a lot of us are realizing in adulthood that like, oh, okay, really don't like crowds. Sometimes I just want to stare at a blank wall. Sometimes I really do a deep dive on topics. This is a lot like this particular flavor of neurodivergence, or I can't sit still, autism or ADHD. When I was a kid was defined by like, you are socially incompetent. These things are driving you and you can't not do them. But we also know there's many different flavors of it where you are able to, since we do call that like a spectrum. It is classified as a disorder in some classifications, and I don't think that's entirely.
I don't subscribe to the disorder part. I mean, I know it's in the DSM, but that's because you need something for insurance companies. But really, the way I see it is honestly, we all have fingerprints because of the way we were developed in the womb. We all have brain prints because of the way we were developed in the womb.
Yeah.
That's neurodivergence is our brain print.
Oh, that's a really good way of seeing it. I'm going to use that. Yeah, that's awesome. The trouble with the brain print is that you have to kind of peel back the skull and then
and it's hard to see, and then put it on the paper and have the FBI know where it is.
And then you're like, I forgot the word for a Turing test.
You found it.
Exactly. Nailed it. I think we all have brain prints. Watching early improv, it felt like there were people who locked in to the emotional part of it. And that was harder for me, especially being unaware of the term neurodivergence. I don't feel like it existed in the mid to late 90s. It was like, there were certain aspects that I could be like Rain Man, but also for the most part, I could be not that. And I thought, assuming that I can choose not to be that, then This was where my brain mapping, especially seeing other people, made some erroneous assumptions. Other people have just made that choice. I can make that choice. Other people enjoy being around people as much as they do. They're very brave. It's satisfying in my later decades to realize they don't have to be brave. That's just how it works for them. Letting that happen or not happen, like for me, I can feel less guilty about times when I'm like, you know what? I'm going to skip the after party and go home because that is what I need. And if I don't do that, then yeah, I'm going to get closer to meltdown condition and no one's going to enjoy that.
How has that then reflected on your parenting with your kids? Because you've probably been able to identify moments in their experience where you're like, let's skip the after party now because I see you need something else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it bleeds into a lot of good parenting choices, which are encouraged nowadays. One of those is if you don't want to touch someone, you don't have to. Like the aunt comes in for the hug, wants to grab your cheeks, you say no. No is no. And we really respect that. I would say that in the back of my head, there's a running budget that I have for my own. I can stand to do this for so long. Or like, yeah, it's sort of a budget. And so like I'm going to spend this number of emotional spoons and then I'm going to need to recharge. And sometimes that means guilt-free doom scrolling at 11 at night or taking a nap in the middle of the day. I try and be aware of my own kids' spoons. And also there are times when, let's say you're traveling, okay, everyone's just going to be exhausted. We are going to be in meltdown city and that's going to be okay. We don't have any real other choice. And I guess this more lightly reflects on improv, but I will say there are shows you don't want to do. Anyone who's had a consistent schedule of improv shows has felt that, or like just the nerves leading up to a show is like, oh, I don't want to do that. And then you're like, well, I guess I gotta. And you just know that you're in the red. There will be breaks. Another aspect, both parenting and neurodivergence, maybe it is counter to improv. I'm going to say this is actually maybe a little bit counter to the improv I grew up in. A lot of my stuff was around Improv Olympic and comedy sports, and to a lesser extent, the Second City in Chicago. There's a whole pool of people, and it felt like a funny fight club at times. There was a cult-like aspect to that. There was the sense of like, if you're not going at a full bore, you're just not doing it enough. These people are succeeding because they put the pedal to the metal and just did it. This is where parenting runs counter to that because it's like, no, we're not going to floor it. We need to pull back, scale back, and honestly assess each other. This is not a time for pushing boundaries. This is a time for being off stage, backstage, or supporting to pull in improv. Support your partner by allowing them to be silent or walk off when they need to
be what they need and to enable that, whatever that is. I think that's an extremely powerful thing. You said you and your wife, both improvisers. How have you found the experience of diffusing conflict or tension in the family, or, people don't want to do things? How do you get things done? Is there any way that you've incorporated play, listening, collaboration, the lessons of improv into the process of achieving this?
I'm going to say almost not at all, but that's my knee-jerk reaction. So yeah, how do we handle conflict in a improv fashion? I'm going to actually say that I think mostly our familial conflict and relationship guide comes from more, I think we studied that we subscribe more to the Gottman Institute. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. Very firm ideas on the foundational aspects of relationships from relatively early on into like my 30s. The Gottman Institute has a nice way of sort of tweaking that. It's not against improv. It just feels like it takes some of the best aspects of it and takes away the need to be funny and enhances the listening to maybe where improv could and should be. But I would say that it was rarely my experience in improv, which is just you listen. Let's say there is a conflict and your partner comes to you and is like, I am so mad at you. The dishes have been in the sink for 2 days. You said you'd do them. No one get anything done. And your response could be, well, why didn't you do them? That would be heightening. Or even like, well, I didn't do the dishes because you didn't do the laundry. There are many ways to handle that poorly. And there are ways to handle that well. It's actually where it comes to Meisner technique. So you're telling me that you're mad at me because I didn't do the dishes. This is where I'm going to go back to Martin DeMott because he had a magic trick. And I'm not going to say that this was like an improv magic trick. It was more his human magic trick that he did in like conversations in one-on-one. He would say something like, oh, you must feel so mad because you can't eat a proper meal because the dishes aren't done.
Mm.
How your mind would be in that condition, and kind of put himself in there. And then he would like figure out speculatively, like, oh, did you feel this? He would come up with different ways to connect to that. And he could be wrong. I mean, your answer might be, no, I didn't feel that way at all. I just ate ice cream. I was fine. I'm a couple pounds heavier, but I'm fine. With listening and putting yourself into that situation, I think that is the best conflict resolution that I've found. It doesn't work 100% of the time, because sometimes people are just mad, and you let them. Sometimes people are on the verge of a meltdown, and you understand that. You give them a safe space to melt down. Kids, especially my kids, but I think a lot of kids, at the start of school, they're like, summer vacation is over. They're like, fine, I'm bored anyway. They go back to school, and then their first week they come home and they're a nightmare. They're just like, I can't do anything. Everything's stupid. What did I do wrong? The problem is that they're at school. They've got the pressure of school. Now they've got a new schedule and they're learning new things, and they lost all their intellectual muscles over the summer. So it's building back up, and they're holding that all in during the day. You're a safe space for them to explode.
Yes.
Recognizing that is useful, but I would say it's not necessarily improv. It's just related to experience at parenting.
It's interesting that the two overlap in a lot of places. Is listening an improv thing, or is listening just what good people do? Is collaboration or giving safe space an improv thing, or is that just what good parents do?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, it's not exclusively for improv, and it's not exclusively for improvisers then, is it? It's just like, here's some things that anybody can do that help make being a parent a little easier or more effective.
I think that's very true. That reminded me of somebody saying, I can't properly attribute this quote, but are you familiar with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics? A robot cannot harm a human, or by inaction cause a human to come to harm. Rule 2 is a robot must obey a human where it does not come into conflict with rule number 1. Rule 3 is a robot must preserve itself when it does not come into conflict with rules 1 and 2. Somebody pointed out, those are general, and they're obviously not true programmatic laws or rules, but they're the basis for a great number of stories that Isaac Asimov wrote. They're also good rules for people. They're just good rules for living.
Just be decent and try to help.
Try and be helpful and keep yourself alive. Make sure you don't harm people in the process of keeping yourself alive. Like there's a hierarchy, and generally, if you obey that hierarchy, you will be a good citizen. Hopefully not a robot, because on top of that, there's creativity, but yeah. And so I think that there's a one-to-one comparison to improv, which is generally those improv rules serve to make us better humans. I'm sorry to go off on a tangent here, but it's a useful tangent. I got to hear Del Close was one of my teachers. He was talking about the origin of the first sets of rules for improv. They were putting on a show at Second City, and they were going to put, I think it was pirate themed. And so it was going to be a musical, and everybody started writing for it. Everybody was writing a scene, and they assembled the show, and the show was 4 hours long. They're like, wow, highly commercially unviable, because the actors were writing it, the dishwasher was writing it, the waitress was writing it, and they started delving into these scenes. And one of the things that they found was, it was like, okay, it's time to swab the deck. I don't want to swab the deck. Well, you have to swab it. Well, I don't want to swab the deck. Well, you have to. Well, here's the mop. It's not a mop. It's a sword. He quickly found the brilliance of that was in distilling everything that was wrong with these scenes, and being able to say, okay, if we just eliminate these things, then these scenes will come together and they will flow. And so then it's a Czech mathematician / writer, and whose name I don't ever remember, who talks about flow, and like being in a state of flow is like a really ideal form for a lot of people, particularly neurodivergents. When people get into a state of flow, time seems to not exist. Tasks that otherwise seem difficult and require immense concentration don't. You go from one to the next, swimming from thing to thing. The best improv is that. The best way to live life is that. We know that's not life a lot of the time, but we sort of try and give ourselves safe spaces to exist in that.
Yeah. Matt, I could talk to you for a lot longer, but I've already kept you on for about 45 minutes on this. So what I'd like to do is this time ask you one last question, but
Huh?
kind of you can reserve. Maybe I could come back and talk to you some more.
Oh, sure.
I think there's a lot more that we could cover. Last question then is if somebody was becoming a new parent,
Mhm.
what guidance could you give them that would help them be the parent they want to be and the parent that their kid needs?
Theory is only so good until the rubber meets the road, basically. You can read all the parenting guides you want. People will have no end of advice to offer you. You can take classes at Second City, Improv Olympic, or wherever you want, Upright Citizens Brigade, and everyone will offer you the one technique that you need to make your parenting or your improv the best. And you will find your own path as long as you stay curious and out of judgment of yourself and your child. Your child is going to grow how they're going to grow. You will nurture that child, a metaphor that I love. You will also irritate your child just enough, like the grain of sand in the flesh of the oyster. They will coat that and create a pearl out of it. So just know, like, love your child and irritate them just enough that they'll always grow.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Thank you.